Welcome. My name is Steve Saitzyk. I'm International Director of Shambhala Art. I'm an adjunct professor of Humanities and Sciences out at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, which now has a South Campus as well as a North Campus. Today's little presentation is about discipline, spontaneity, and creativity. And I hope to make it a bit of a discussion and not just a talk. But I do like to define terms in the beginning. And since we have three terms, I thought it might be wise to offer some kind of definition. I've had the advantage over all of you because I went to the dictionary and looked up a number of these terms. I also found that most words have several or multiple definitions, so I could at least pick the ones that are most self-serving for tonight's talk. But the point of this is to take one of these definitions and also see if there's a way in which meditation, the practice of meditation, informs it in some way so that we're better understand it and an approach. So I looked up, one of the things I looked up was discipline. And I found training that corrects, molds, or perfects the mental faculties or moral character. That to me sounds a little stiff, almost slightly heavy-handed. But what do we mean by meditation in terms of discipline, or discipline in terms of meditation? Is it too soon for the mic? Anybody want to engage that? Try that?
Well, I mean, the word that comes up to mind is practice.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think it applies to both, does it not? You know,
Right.
discipline is...
I don't think it's turned on.
Okay. Turned on now? No?
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
Well, yeah,
In any case, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I just, the word practice came up
Yeah.
too. Discipline sometimes, you have to practice to get disciplined or be disciplined to practice.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, art or meditation or
What are we practicing?
getting better,
At
whatever.
what? And what does it have to do in terms of meditation? How does meditation inform this? And by the way, anyone else can grab the mic and leap in. Jennifer.
To me, it's more when I'm sitting on the cushion and I'm meditating, and my mind goes somewhere else. It's bringing it back rather than, once I notice that it's gone, it's bringing it back rather than letting it stay there or sending it somewhere else or doing like a million other things I could do with it. It's just having the wherewithal to say, okay, now what I want to do is bring it back. So it's just that process of continuing to come back.
And what are we bringing it back to?
Present moment.
Present moment, as opposed to bringing it back to all the things we need to do or all the
Right.
hopes and fears and trials and tribulations and objectives and goals and all of that. So it's basically we're trying to return our mind to the present moment. That's the discipline of doing it over and over and over again. We're training our mind. We're actually training ourselves and our mind to be able to place our minds where we want it to be. Okay. And I just recalled something that Sakyong Mipan Rinpoche responded once to people saying, well, it's very hard to meditate. I can't meditate. And his response was, well, but we do meditate all the time. We're just meditating on our worries, our concerns, the television, a movie, some entertainment, or our pets, or whatever. So we do. It's just a matter of shifting the object of meditation to something that might benefit us. So discipline in this case is just, it's not beating ourselves up and whipping ourselves into shape. It's actually the gentle process of returning our minds to being in the present moment. So over and over again until we're in that present moment as best we can. It creates some kind of space, which we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, because I like the term spontaneity, so I'd like to try to take that one on a little bit. So I have a couple of things for that. It comes from a Latin word that means to one's own accord. And spontaneity means arising from a natural inclination, not from external excitement or constraint. What does that mean? Means we're not trying to get it up, and we're not trying to manage it once it is, which is often what we think we do. It's time to be spontaneous. Let's be spontaneous now on the count of 3. 1, 2. Okay, it's kind of crazy. But what is spontaneity? What are other words that we associate with it? Does anyone want to take that on? What do we mean by spontaneous when we say we're trying to be spontaneous? So what's the relationship between impulsiveness and spontaneity?
Oh, man.
Now it gets harder.
What is the...
Well, we also have reactiveness in addition to it. We also have the, I don't want to get too ahead, but we also have automatic. So we have spontaneity, we have reactiveness, we have impulsiveness, we have automatic. I'm assuming the reason why we have the different words is because there's some subtle difference between each of these things. So can we say what they are? We're touching on it, and if we look at it from the point of view of meditation, that might help us to understand these things. Thus, do we impulsively meditate? So, to me, often I find the word, or what impulsiveness connotates, is a kind of aggression. In other words, I want to do this right now. Okay. It's not like, I want to do this right now.
It's lack of control.
Yeah. Lack of control. Yeah. And what is out of control? Is that going too far? So, what about automatic? What is that?
That's what we do every day.
We're on cruise control. Right, we're not really thinking and we're not really feeling.
Driving to work and then I got here.
Right, you just showed up. You just go to work and don't know how we got there when we arrive. So what we're hinting at here is spontaneity is less about reactiveness, where we react to something, as opposed to being responsive. Often when we're reacting, we're not really paying all that much attention to what's going on. We're reacting to some projection, something we partially heard. Responsiveness, you're responding, but you also have to be, to some degree, involved or in touch with what's going on to properly respond. So there's a clue there. So where does spontaneity arise from? So is spontaneity an emotional response? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's some kind of emotion involved.
Well, what comes first? Emotions and then spontaneity? So we could argue then maybe it's the other way around. Spontaneity and then emotions. Well, we have part of this definition that we have in the dictionary is arising from a natural inclination. What is meant by a natural inclination? What is that? What is natural? Well, one of the terms that, by the way, we have this book, True Perception, The Path of Dharma Art by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And one of the things that's talked about in that book is a term that probably most of us as meditators know and is used, of course, all over the world, I think, and that is square one, the notion of square one. In terms of meditation, we're talking about coming back to this place called square one. So I'm proposing is that spontaneity arises out of square one. So if that's true, what is square one for it to rise out of? Anyone want to take that on?
What is the question?
What is square one if that's where spontaneity arises? And if that's too much, we could just say, what's square one?
Well, it would seem that to me that spontaneity arises out of emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
That would be square one, right?
And how would you... Well, it's interesting because, again, I'm maybe a little too much into semantics here at the moment. Emptiness has a special twist. So a lot of it depends on what you mean specifically by emptiness. It gets into the whole issue. I'm not saying we should answer this tonight, but what is it empty of? So one of the things that, see if you agree with this, is when we arrive at square one, there's a sense of spaciousness in space. So what would you think comes first, space or emptiness?
Could go either way.
So what I would propose for tonight's talk, in terms of emptiness, that emptiness is kind of a realization or an understanding that one has, maybe in light of experiencing space or spaciousness. So when we are meditating, ideally we're returning our mind somewhere, and nowness, and one of the things that we often experience in nowness is a certain amount of sense of spaciousness, for which things can arise. And they can arise naturally. And there's where spontaneity can arise from. We can't say, like I said earlier on, we're now going to be spontaneous, 1, 2, count down to it. But we can bring our minds and experience into this sense of nowness and space, for which something can arise. To be spontaneous, though, assuming spontaneity can arise out of this space, what do we have to be in this space, to be spontaneous? And one of the things we have to be is we have to be tuned in. How can you be spontaneous if you're tuned out? Then you're impulsive or reactive or automatic because you're not tuned in. You're just superimposing whatever is going on within you onto the situation rather than being responsive to the situation. So as we work our way through these things, one of the things that comes up is that can we be, in a sense, self-referencing, self-conscious, self-dialoguing, and be spontaneous at the same time? I'm seeing some people nodding heads, 1, 2 people going the other direction. And in some sense, can we do those two things at once? Interesting. In other words, I'm trying to remember how Anne puts it, but it's kind of like, can you have a thought and an experience at the same time? Is that the phrase? An opinion and an experience at the same time.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, in some sense, it seems to me, particularly if you read quotes by artists when they're talking about in the moment of creativity, that they had to get out of the way. And that doesn't mean you lose your mind, you lose consciousness. We're not really talking about you start your art project and then wake up several hours later and have a result. We're talking about you have your awareness, but you're not necessarily constantly self-referencing, being self-conscious, and necessarily having a self-dialogue. You are conscious. You are aware, and you are present. But part of this is to allow ourselves to surrender a bit into the moment, and that we can be present and now and have an experience and an awareness. So if we try to put discipline and spontaneity together, how does that work? Because when most people hear the word discipline and spontaneity, they kind of think they're kind of opposite or defeat each other. And mush it together so somehow we're trying to be spontaneous as some kind of form of discipline. So how does that work? Yes? Right, so if I hear you correctly, discipline in some sense is the path to spontaneity.
Yeah.
The coming back over and over again. Now there's two things going on with discipline in that particular case that you're describing. One is you do need to learn a certain amount to let go. just as we have to learn how to meditate and sit and follow the directions. And as many teachers have said in the beginning, we pretend to meditate, and then one day we discover we're actually meditating. Just like at some point we discover we're playing the piano or we're painting a painting. So discipline is the ground or the path to spontaneity, not control. So it's the control aspect that we all have issues with, I'm sure. Forgive me if I'm not speaking for you, but a lot of us have issues about trying to keep control of the situation and what's going on and our place in it. And there's a lot of disciplines that bring us to this moment, to square one. It's just that we're proposing here in this context is that one of the most effective, gentle, and kind methods, particularly to yourself, to engage in discipline, to bring you to square one, is meditation. It's not the only way. It just so happens it's pretty darn effective. I should have looked up the word control too. But my sense of the word control is that we really, really don't want to do it. And we know we're supposed to control ourselves because we've been taught to control ourselves. Or in this case, we're looking at discipline from the point of view that it's a pathway to something. That we do, one of my meditation teachers said, half the practice of meditation is arriving at the pillow. So part of it is bringing yourself there. So it's a discipline of repeatedly coming back and creating the environment for which things can develop in terms of meditative practice. Whereas control, I always think of, even if you had a meditation practice, you're doing it to control your emotions, control your thoughts, control your life, rather than engage it, rather than be responsive to it, rather than being tuned into it. Tuned in, it's too inconvenient, it's not efficient, it takes too much time, it takes too much effort. Whereas if I just control it, I don't have to bother with the rest of it. So that's the sense that I have of that. I don't know if that's helpful. So that's the best I can do without a dictionary. So one of the things that about creativity is the sense of spaciousness allows something new to arise. When we don't give ourselves that sense of space, not much new happens. And if it does, we're often too speedy or too self-involved to recognize it when it does. So part of this process of relating to creativity, in fact, to create is to produce something new, such as a work of art, using our talents and imagination. But creativity is a process, and it begins with coming back to square one, sense of spaciousness, in the practice of meditation. In fact, before I go on with this, what do we develop in the process of meditation? What is some of the things that we notice when we meditate? We have little glimpses of what? Is that presence? What else? What do we notice when we are present? Clarity. Anything else that we notice? Right? Yes? I want to follow this clarity though, but that's true. We do notice more. But how do we know the difference between stuff that arises in this space and something that might be inspiration? And there is all forms of things that arise. And whenever we slow down, whether it be through meditation or any kind of repetitive activity that we're engaged in and slowing down process, one of the things that we notice is there's a certain clarity that occurs. And because of that clarity, there are often various kinds of results, such as solution to a problem, inspiration arises, stuff arises. But sometimes in the beginning, when you're teaching meditation and someone's learning meditation and they develop some spaciousness, one of the first things that they notice is an awful lot more stuff arises rather than anything else. So part of it is coming back and creating more space so that what arises can be seen more for what it is. And one of the central things that's talked about is vividness, in addition to clarity. One of the things that people experience when they have inspiration or when they're sitting in meditation from time to time, they have moments of clarity and vividness. And that's something that's talked about not just in this book, but in fact, Allen Ginsberg used to talk about how in the creative process, vividness is self-selecting. We can recognize it when it arises. So there's a certain kind of clarity that takes place, we recognize it, and we can begin to see that it's a certain kind of inspiration. So out of that space, because you've given it some space, something can arise and be seen and recognized. And then after that, it's a matter of what you choose to do with it, whether you choose to manifest it, realize it, solve a problem, whatever takes place. So we have discipline, which in this case we're encouraging you the discipline of training your mind to come back to the moment. And in fact, through this whole process of practicing meditation, what begins to happen is it starts carrying over to your daily life. So within that situation, you find yourself being able to come back to the present moment even though you're not on the pillow. Solutions potentially arise or experiences arise, clarity, just moments of being having a vivid experience occur, whether you do anything about it or not. And we don't have to do anything about it unless we choose to or not. And so spontaneity comes out of that discipline of returning over and over again to the moment. And creativity is basically where, in some sense, choosing to pay attention to what does arise and see if we want to put that to work in some fashion. There's another term that I want to talk about just briefly because it comes up often when I teach at Art Center College, and that is this notion of accuracy. And that is, a lot of people are concerned with accuracy. Particularly, Zan and I talk about people learning to draw and paint in the beginning. They'll try to do very detailed, representational kinds of activities. And they want to be faithful to that because they feel there's some kind of truth in the accuracy itself. So where does accuracy fit into this? What if you're interested in reproducing the world, or some truth, or being true to your process, or to some truth that you realize in it? Where does accuracy fit in this? Does it have any place at all?
That seems to be, I don't know.
So what is the difference between accuracy and spontaneity, if you can summarize?
If you're trying to be too accurate, I don't think you're being I don't think spontaneity has anything to do with it.
Right, 'cause if we're trying to be accurate, then we have pre-programmed spontaneity, which is not spontaneity. Well, first of all, just because we're talking about accuracy doesn't mean that we're saying accuracy, because we're saying that accuracy coming first leads to pre-programmed spontaneity, that doesn't mean that accuracy doesn't have a role. The difference is, where does it have its role? And the interesting thing about spontaneity is that with spontaneity, if you are tuned in, you will automatically be accurate and faithful. You just have to lead with spontaneity. And before you can lead with spontaneity, you have to lead with basically space and square one. Well, let's take it a little further. To be accurate, to supposedly, we'll take drawing for a moment because I'm very familiar with that. We have to kind of measure. We have to separate ourselves. We have to know where we are, what the perspective is, what's going on, what it looks like. We have to make sure we get the right proportions and everything else. We have to separate out from it. Spontaneity, that duality does not exist. That's, in a sense, vaporized. It's gone, at least for the brief moment that we may be spontaneous. But because you are tuned in, because you now do not have that separation, your result is accurate, because you're already tuned in. Now, it's hard to trust that.
Very hard to
Right, because we assume that if we don't have that separation, it will all fall apart. But in some sense, if we are going to meditate, we are trusting that that view of accuracy, that approach to accuracy, is not going to work fundamentally. That ultimately we have to let go. We have to actually trust what arises in the moment, and not what we think should arise in the moment. So I don't want to say there's a blind faith involved here. It's not. The idea is if you do meditate, you are working in that direction, and basically, if you do draw, you know that so much of the truth that's revealed in drawings has nothing to do with what things exactly look like. In fact, the cubists, of course, were smashing everything down the planes that we don't see three-dimensionally. It's a construct in our brain for the most part. So they had that observation. They sandwiched their artwork. That's just one of the ways of looking at Cubism. And of course, people would look at Cubism, particularly at the time that it was developed, and that these people didn't know how to draw. They just, they weren't artists. They had no abilities. It was just kind of stupid. And of course, that's not the case. Picasso could certainly draw. But we're taking the approach that when you have clarity, you have precision. You're present. There's clarity in that sense. And but sometimes people will take that to mean, I am now precisely following my breath. It's actually going out. It's probably this many liters of air coming out. It's flowing into the room, and it should go through my nose. I should feel the little tip, the thing, the in-breath should come in, and my mouth should be slightly open. The tongue should be exactly touching the tip. Do you get the idea? Okay. That's trying to be accurate, not really precise. Precise is just being present, fully present. If you are, then the precision, I think, also occurs. But that's important to understand. An end product is not necessarily the point. Your inspiration could be just the experience of Dharma realization or pursuing the Dharma. That I don't know that you could. I guess some people could say there's an end product there. I guess it could be argued even if you say that your goal is not to produce a product, that is a product. Just like all art communicates, even when it's not. It communicates that. So in some sense you could argue that. But it's not so much do we have the right answer. These things actually tweak our minds so that through cognitive science it's understood that when you have a new thought, a new understanding, you actually create the ground for larger experiences and new neural pathways. I don't want to say that we should lead with our thoughts, because that's not at all what these particular teachings that have to do with art are about. It's really about leading with direct experience, but at the same time, leading with direct experience does not mean that our thought sense, our thought understanding, our intellect is somehow inferior or should be given up or disregarded or lost in any way, because it's that direct experience that is informed by understanding, and that understanding leads toward direct experience, and it continues to inform each other and grow and expand. But when we are starting from anywhere, if we are starting from square one and we're in that moment, we want to lead with experience. Then our thoughts are actually based on experience, as opposed to our experience based on our thoughts, which means that all our experience is limited to what we can think. And we can experience more than we think. But we can use our thought processes to grow and still go beyond, because there is such thing as indirect experience and direct experience. Direct experience is when we directly experience things, and then there are things where we can't have that experience without knowing something. For example, as one artist once told me, said, people would come to my studio and they don't understand, how I make my artwork. But if I went to that person's laboratory and they're a scientist and I go in there, I would have no idea what they're doing in any way of appreciating it. So there are these two types of experience that you can have, and one is not better or worse than the other. But given all things equal, you want to try to lead with experience so that what your thoughts are actually based on something rather than thoughts about thoughts about thoughts about thoughts, which is endless and often divorced from reality when they get to a certain point.
Reality test in this process.
Well, I'm going to leave out the word reality for the moment. Okay, that's
You brought it up.
too big. I'm going to dodge it then.
Okay.
But I won't dodge the question. Feedback is important. Okay, but there's a difference between, I do this a lot with words, but feedback is important. Self-confirmation is a problem. Okay, so feedback is information, so that if you do wish to communicate something, if you do have a product that you want to produce, then we often do share that because we do want to hear how people respond to it, because feedback is helpful. We have our own set of senses and culture and so forth, and it's helpful along the path. The hard part is to separate out the self-confirmation, like, oh, they don't love me because they don't like my work, or this person's not reading my stuff properly when I ask them. They could have spent more time, and I don't like their comments because it's obviously. We're trying to get past self-confirmation to feedback, which the phenomenal world, even as we practice meditation, is constantly giving us feedback all the time. It's not like there's a little guy in a shop somewhere creating little messages for us, that kind of thing. We're not saying that. What we are saying is the world is constantly presenting itself and spontaneously arising, and we're often disregarding what occurs in favor of what we think should be happening. So leaving aside the notion of reality, feedback is important, particularly if you are trying to communicate something. But sometimes their creative process is one where they have no intention specifically of communicating anything specifically, or they really don't care if other people respond or not to it, because they're really doing it because they're communicating with themselves. It's their internal dialogue, whatever it is. There's nothing particularly good or bad about that. Talking about whether we think there's good art or bad art is a whole other discussion. But where so we were talking about feedback, good and bad, but in my opinion, it all begins with coming back to square one before we start forming any kinds of opinions. We want to make sure that we're at least grounded in whatever our experience is, and to be as present as possible, and then see what arises. Like when we do contemplative viewing, we want to come back to square one, engage whatever we're looking at, say it's a painting, fully with our senses. We want to see what arises before we start looking at labels, figuring out who the artist is, knowing all of that extra stuff. In fact, we want to just put it aside if we can briefly for a moment, have our own experience, see what arises, communicate that, and then share that with others. And then through that collection of experiences, we then go back and relook, take a fresh look, put all of that stuff aside, and see what then arises. So it's a process of, this is a very simplified instruction for contemplative viewing, but that's a way in which we can start and keep coming back to square one over and over again and have a fresh look and develop our own sense of appreciation and sharing with others, and see if that can be informed, and to go on from there and build on that. And then if we want to get to good or bad, it's another story. I do find sometimes with contemplative viewing that sometimes after the process has been engaged for a little while, that we sometimes look at the label and people will sometimes say, I don't know if that art historian wrote the right thing about this art, or if they really looked at it. I don't know, So I don't want to say that happens all the time, but that is sometimes an experience that people have. And you reminded me of something also that I totally, of course, agree with that, not just because you're my wife. But when we do arrive at square one, we sometimes have this notion, because we're really talking about a space that, to a degree, is without aggression, without ego. We think somehow, well, whatever inspiration arises out of that, if it's not doesn't have any aggression or ego, it must be kind of dull or boring or lack energy. And it's important to understand that's not the case. It can be quite energetic, amazingly energetic. The analogy I often use is that if you look at particularly Tibetan Buddhist art, we see a lot of peaceful deities, but we also see an awful lot of wrathful deities. In fact, I think the wrathful deities might actually outnumber the peaceful deities by millions, I think, according to my teacher. The truth can sometimes be quite a wrathful experience. Inspiration can sometimes be quite dynamic and challenging. It's not all just, flowers and puppy dogs. So sometimes we have that image, like if we have an inspiration that's quite strong and powerful and challenging, that undercuts us and we have a strong reaction to, maybe there's something wrong with us, but that's not necessarily the case. It could be right on the money. So appreciation it's more than just appreciating the roses, which is of course very important, but appreciating what arises out of that space, and as my teacher used to talk about, the truth of things as they are. Well, spontaneity slides into action at a certain place. It doesn't mean you automatically, in my understanding, have to take action. You can have a spontaneous thought, just as you could have a spontaneous activity. So, and you may have a spontaneous thought, and then see that it's just simply inappropriate. You might want to bean some small child on the head for going on and on and on and stuff, but you're not going to do that. So I see it as a bit of a sliding scale. I don't think by you're not acting that you're not having a spontaneous situation. You're just not necessarily acting on it. There is experience and there is thought. Experience that arises is really only understood in the context of understanding an intellect. And intellect that arises without experience is divorced from reality. So it's always putting the two together somewhere. So one could easily argue that doing something outrageous at a meeting and choosing not to do it, may be some intelligence involved there. Okay. Or maybe the intelligence would have been to get up and do something. The thing is that's why feedback is important. You don't know sometimes until you do it. Well, it's an interesting point that you raise, and that is, it's sometimes hard for people on the outside to know whether someone is being impulsive or spontaneous. Often we can feel it at a gut level, but usually only the person themselves really can know for sure, at their own gut level as to what they're doing. So there are times when we can tell, times when we can't tell. So
I would suggest it's the feedback. What you say, it's the feedback that can maybe distinguish the two.
Yeah. I just don't want. It's important that we don't try to control too much. If anything, we want to try to see what arises, test it out. Sometimes it does involve doing something that maybe we're not really so sure whether it's impulsivity or spontaneity, and we test it out, because I'm leaning in the favor of going further than finding other ways to pull back, because we usually seem to have innumerable ways of doing that and not the other. But if there is any place where I draw the line, it's being unkind and harmful to others. So in that case, if you need to pull back, you should pull back. So with that, I have a couple of little announcements. One is there is a Shambhala Art website, if you're not aware of that, shambhalaart.org. Okay, please visit it. We also have a Facebook page, Shambhala Art Facebook, which you can which we'd like that also to take place if you don't mind. So I think that concludes what I have to say. So hope you enjoyed it, and well, thank you for coming.